The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as Royal Guard Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he believed would be another ordinary day. At 52, Thomas had served the royal family for over 20 years, standing motionless for hours, eyes forward, never breaking protocol. His weathered face showed the discipline of decades, but behind his stoic expression lay a man struggling with personal demons that threatened to consume him. Thomas had joined the Queen's Guard as a young man full of pride and purpose. The honor of protecting the royal family had given his life meaning after a difficult childhood in Manchester. His father had abandoned the family when Thomas was 12, leaving his mother to raise 3 children alone. The military structure and the respect that came with the red uniform had filled a void in his heart that he never knew existed. But lately, things had been different. His wife Margaret had been battling cancer for 8 months, and the medical bills were mounting despite the healthcare system. Their daughter Emma, only 16, had grown distant, struggling to cope with her mother's illness. Thomas found himself questioning everything he had believed in. The long hours standing guard meant less time with Margaret during her treatments, and the rigid schedule left little room for the emotional support his family desperately needed. On this particular Tuesday morning, Thomas took his position outside the staterooms where young Prince George would be having his private tutoring sessions. The 10-year-old prince had grown considerably since Thomas first began this particular assignment 2 years ago. Most guards rarely interacted with the royal children beyond the occasional formal acknowledgement, but Thomas had noticed something special about George from the beginning. The boy was different from what people might expect. While the media often portrayed him as just another privileged royal child, Thomas had observed George's genuine curiosity about the world around him. The prince would sometimes pause during his walks and ask his tutors questions about the guards, the castle staff, or even the pigeons that gathered in the courtyard. There was a thoughtfulness in his young eyes that reminded Thomas of his own daughter at that age. As Thomas stood at attention, he could hear the muffled voices of George and his tutor discussing history through the thick wooden doors. The lesson seemed to be about World War II, and Thomas couldn't help but think about his own grandfather, who had served in the Royal Navy during those dark years. The old man had passed away when Thomas was just 18, but not before instilling in him the values of duty, honor, and service to something greater than oneself. The sound of footsteps in the corridor broke Thomas from his thoughts. Prince George emerged from the room with his tutor, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Harrison who had been with the family for several years. As usual, George walked with perfect posture, his school uniform neat, and his brown hair carefully combed. But today, something was different about the boy's demeanor. Instead of walking past Thomas as protocol demanded, Prince George slowed his pace and glanced up at the guard. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Thomas saw something unexpected. The boy's expression wasn't the casual indifference of privilege, but rather a look of genuine concern and curiosity. It was as if George was trying to see beyond the uniform to the person underneath. Mrs. Harrison gently guided the prince forward, reminding him of his schedule, but George continued to glance back at Thomas as they walked down the long corridor. The guard felt an odd sensation, as if the boy had somehow sensed the turmoil beneath his professional facade. It seemed impossible, yet there had been something almost knowing in those young eyes. The rest of the morning passed without incident, but Thomas found himself thinking about that brief moment of connection. During his lunch break, he sat alone in the guard's common room, picking at a sandwich while his mind wandered to Margaret's appointment with the oncologist that afternoon. The prognosis had not been encouraging, and Thomas felt helpless watching the woman he loved grow weaker each day. His phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "Mum's really scared about today's appointment. Wish you could be there." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Here he was, standing guard over a palace while his wife faced her fears alone. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days protecting a family while feeling unable to protect his own. When Thomas returned to his post after lunch, he noticed increased activity around the staterooms. There were whispered conversations among the staff, and several official-looking visitors coming and going. He maintained his position, eyes forward, but his trained awareness picked up on the subtle changes in the castle's rhythm. Around 3 o'clock, Prince George appeared again, this time without his tutor. The boy was carrying what appeared to be a small wrapped package, and he moved with a determination that seemed unusual for a 10-year-old. As he approached Thomas's position, the guard prepared for the prince to pass by as always. But George didn't pass by. Instead, he stopped directly in front of Thomas and looked up at him with those same thoughtful eyes from earlier. For a moment, neither moved. The protocol was clear. Royal guards did not engage in conversation with family members unless spoken to first, and, even then, responses should be minimal and formal. Prince George seemed to understand this, because he didn't speak. Instead, he simply placed the small wrapped package at Thomas's feet and stepped back. The boy's expression was serious, almost solemn, as if he understood the weight of what he was doing. Without a word, George gave a small, respectful nod and walked away, leaving Thomas staring down at the unexpected gift. The guard's heart raced as he processed what had just happened. Breaking protocol to look down would be a serious violation of his duties, but the package sat there like a puzzle demanding to be solved. Thomas forced himself to maintain his position, eyes forward, even as his mind raced with questions about the prince's mysterious gesture. Hours passed before Thomas's shift ended, and he could finally examine the package. His replacement, Guard Williams, had noticed it too, and waited while Thomas carefully picked up the small wrapped item. The package was light, wrapped in simple brown paper with no identifying marks or writing. In the privacy of the guard's locker room, Thomas unwrapped the package with trembling fingers. Inside was a small wooden figurine of a soldier, hand-carved with remarkable detail. The figure stood at attention, much like Thomas himself, but there was something peaceful about its expression. Attached to the base was a tiny piece of paper with just 4 words written in careful, childish handwriting. "Thank you for watching." Thomas stared at the gift for several minutes, turning it over in his weathered hands. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly not a toy but a piece of art. Someone had spent considerable time creating this figurine, and somehow Prince George had gotten hold of it to give to a guard he barely knew. The emotional impact hit Thomas unexpectedly. After 20 years of service, countless hours of standing at attention, and thousands of days of being essentially invisible to those he protected, this young prince had seen him. Really seen him. Not just as a uniform or a symbol, but as a person worthy of gratitude and recognition. As Thomas drove home that evening, the wooden soldier sat carefully secured in his jacket pocket. The London traffic moved slowly, giving him time to think about the day's unexpected turn. Margaret would be home from her doctor's appointment by now, and he would need to be strong for whatever news awaited him. But, for the first time in months, Thomas felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. Not because his problems had been solved, but because a 10-year-old boy had reminded him that sometimes the smallest gestures could carry the greatest meaning. Prince George's silent gift had spoken louder than any words could have, and Thomas knew his life had been changed by those few moments of unexpected human connection. The wooden soldier would become more than just a gift. It would become a symbol of everything Thomas had forgotten about why he chose this life of service in the first place. Margaret was sitting in their small living room when Thomas arrived home, her thin frame wrapped in the blue cardigan he had bought her for their anniversary 3 years ago. The chemotherapy had taken her beautiful auburn hair, but her smile still lit up the room when she saw him. Emma sat beside her mother on the sofa, both women looking tired but somehow more peaceful than they had in weeks. Thomas carefully hung up his uniform jacket, feeling the weight of the wooden soldier in the pocket. He had decided during the drive home that he would tell them about Prince George's gift, but first he needed to know about the doctor's appointment that had been weighing on all their minds. Margaret's eyes were brighter than they had been in months as she began to speak. The oncologist had delivered news that, while not miraculous, was certainly hopeful. The latest scans showed that the tumor had shrunk more than expected, and the treatment plan could be adjusted to be less aggressive while maintaining its effectiveness. It wasn't a cure, but it was a chance for more time, possibly years more than they had originally hoped for. Emma hugged her father tightly, and for the first time since Margaret's diagnosis, Thomas felt his family coming back together. The fear that had been suffocating them all was beginning to lift, replaced by something resembling the life they had known before. As they shared dinner around their small kitchen table, Thomas found himself really listening to his daughter talk about school, her friends, her dreams of studying art at university. Later that evening, as Margaret slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, Thomas sat in his study and examined the wooden soldier more carefully. Under the lamplight, he could see tiny details that spoke of hours of careful work. The uniform was accurate down to the smallest button, the face carved with a dignity that captured the essence of what it meant to serve. Whoever had created this piece understood the weight of duty and the honor of standing guard. The next morning at Windsor Castle, Thomas found himself looking at Prince George differently. When the young prince passed by during his morning lessons, Thomas noticed things he had missed before. The boy's careful attention to how he treated the staff, the way he listened intently when adults spoke to him, the thoughtful pauses he took before answering questions. This wasn't just a privileged child going through the motions of royal education. This was someone already learning what it meant to carry responsibility for others. During his break, Thomas approached Mrs. Harrison, the prince's tutor, something he had never done before. He asked her, as casually as possible, whether Prince George had shown interest in military history or the castle guards. Mrs. Harrison smiled warmly and explained that the prince had recently been studying the role of the royal guard throughout history and had asked many questions about the men and women who dedicated their lives to protecting others. She mentioned that George had been particularly moved by stories of guards who had served during wartime, men who had stood their posts even when their own families faced hardships at home. The prince had wanted to understand how someone could maintain such dedication when facing personal struggles. Mrs. Harrison had encouraged him to think about ways to show appreciation for service, though she hadn't expected him to act on those thoughts so directly. Thomas realized that Prince George's gift hadn't been a random act of kindness, but a carefully considered gesture born from genuine understanding and empathy. The boy had somehow recognized that the guard standing outside his classroom was a real person with real struggles, and he had found a way to acknowledge that humanity while respecting the formal boundaries that separated their worlds. Over the following weeks, Thomas noticed subtle changes in his interactions with Prince George. The boy never again broke protocol by speaking or leaving gifts, but there were small moments of acknowledgement that meant everything to the guard. A respectful nod when their eyes met in passing, a slight pause when George walked by that seemed to say, "I see you," and sometimes the faintest hint of a smile that reminded Thomas why he had chosen this life of service. The wooden soldier became a source of strength for Thomas during difficult times. He kept it on his bedside table, and each morning before work, he would hold it for a moment and remember that his service mattered to someone. Margaret had been deeply moved when he told her about Prince George's gift, and she began to see her husband's work in a new light. Instead of resenting the time his duties took him away from home, she began to take pride in knowing that he was valued and appreciated. Emma, too, began to understand her father's dedication differently. She asked him to tell her stories about the history of the Royal Guard, and Thomas found himself sharing tales of honor, duty, and sacrifice that he had never thought would interest a teenage girl. Their relationship grew stronger as Emma saw her father not just as someone who was frequently absent, but as someone who was part of something larger and more meaningful than she had realized. But it was during a particularly challenging day that Prince George's gift revealed its true power. Margaret had suffered a setback in her treatment, experiencing severe side effects that sent her to the hospital for 3 days. Thomas was torn between his duty to his post and his desire to be with his wife, a conflict that had been eating at him throughout his career. Standing at his usual position outside the staterooms, Thomas felt the familiar weight of divided loyalties pressing down on him. His phone had been buzzing with updates from Emma, who was trying to manage her mother's care while attending school. The wooden soldier in his pocket seemed to grow heavier as Thomas struggled with the decision that had been building in his mind for weeks. It was then that Prince George appeared for his afternoon lessons, and something in the boy's expression told Thomas that he somehow understood the guard's internal struggle. As George passed by, he moved slightly slower than usual and glanced up at Thomas with eyes that seemed far older than his 10 years. In that brief moment of connection, Thomas felt as if the prince was giving him permission to make the choice his heart was telling him to make. That evening, Thomas sat down at his kitchen table and began writing a letter that would change the course of his life. After 20 years of faithful service, he was submitting his resignation from the Royal Guard. The decision wasn't made in anger or disappointment, but from a newfound understanding of what truly mattered most to him. In his resignation letter, Thomas wrote about the honor he had felt in serving the royal family and protecting the traditions that made Britain great. He explained that his family needed him now in ways that his duty to the crown couldn't accommodate, and that he had come to understand that true service sometimes meant knowing when to step away. But he also wrote about a young prince who had taught him that compassion and understanding could exist even within the most formal structures. Prince George's simple gift had reminded Thomas that his service had meaning beyond just following protocol, and that recognition had given him the strength to make difficult choices about his future. The process of leaving the Royal Guard was both sad and liberating. Thomas's fellow guards understood his decision, and many admitted they had watched him struggle with the balance between duty and family for months. His commanding officers accepted his resignation with respect, acknowledging his years of exemplary service and expressing genuine concern for his family's well-being. On his final day at Windsor Castle, Thomas stood at his post one last time, knowing that Prince George would pass by during his afternoon lessons. When the moment came, the young prince paused slightly and looked up at the guard who had been a constant presence in his daily routine for 2 years. Prince George stopped walking and stood perfectly still in front of Thomas, his young face showing a maturity that surprised everyone present, including Mrs. Harrison. The hallway fell silent as the 10-year-old prince and the veteran guard shared what they both somehow knew would be their final moment together in this formal setting. Without breaking protocol himself, Prince George slowly raised his hand to his heart and then extended it slightly toward Thomas in a gesture that was unmistakably one of gratitude and farewell. It wasn't a formal salute, but something more personal and meaningful. The boy's eyes conveyed everything that words couldn't express in their restricted environment: respect, understanding, and genuine care for the man who had stood guard over his daily life. Thomas felt his throat tighten as he maintained his professional composure, but he allowed himself the slightest nod of acknowledgement in return. In that moment, both the prince and the guard understood that their connection had transcended the boundaries of their respective roles. They had found a way to honor both duty and humanity in a single, perfect gesture. Mrs. Harrison watched the exchange with amazement, later describing it to colleagues as one of the most moving displays of mutual respect she had ever witnessed. The other staff members present fell silent, recognizing that they were seeing something extraordinary unfold between these two very different people who had found common ground in the most unlikely circumstances. As Prince George continued down the hallway, he walked with even more purpose than usual, as if the encounter had reinforced his understanding of what it meant to lead with compassion. For Thomas, the moment provided the perfect ending to a career that had been transformed by an unexpected friendship built on silent understanding and shared respect. The transition away from the Royal Guard proved to be exactly what Thomas and his family needed. With his pension and the money he had saved over 20 years of service, Thomas was able to find work with more flexible hours at a local security firm. The pay was less, but the freedom to be present for Margaret's medical appointments and Emma's important school events was invaluable. Margaret's health continued to improve steadily over the following months. The reduced stress in their household, combined with Thomas's increased presence and support, seemed to accelerate her recovery. The doctors were amazed by her progress, and while they remained cautiously optimistic, the family began to plan for a future that had seemed impossible just a year before. Emma flourished with her father's increased involvement in her life. She excelled in her art classes and began creating her own wooden sculptures, inspired by the story of Prince George's gift to her father. Her talent was remarkable, and Thomas realized that his daughter had inherited an artistic gift that deserved nurturing and support. The wooden soldier remained on Thomas's bedside table, but its meaning continued to evolve. What had begun as a symbol of recognition and gratitude became a reminder of the courage it takes to make difficult but necessary life changes. Thomas would often hold the small figure when facing new challenges, remembering the wisdom that a 10-year-old prince had shown in understanding that true strength sometimes meant choosing love over duty. 6 months after leaving the Royal Guard, Thomas received an unexpected letter addressed in elegant handwriting that he didn't recognize. Inside was a formal invitation to a small ceremony at Windsor Castle, requesting his presence for what was described as recognition of exceptional service to the crown. Thomas was confused, as he had already received his standard retirement acknowledgement when he left the guard. When he arrived at the castle on the appointed day, Thomas was surprised to find himself in a small, private room with only a handful of people present. Mrs. Harrison was there, along with several senior members of the royal household staff, and Prince George himself, now 11 years old and looking more mature than when Thomas had last seen him. A palace official explained that Prince George had requested this special ceremony after learning about Thomas's resignation and the circumstances surrounding it. The young prince had wanted to formally acknowledge the guard's years of faithful service and to express his understanding that Thomas's decision to leave had been made from love for his family, not from any lack of dedication to his duties. Prince George stepped forward, carrying a beautifully crafted wooden box that Thomas immediately recognized as being made by the same artisan who had created the soldier figurine. The prince spoke clearly and confidently, his words carefully chosen and obviously well-rehearsed. "Mr. Mitchell," Prince George began, "your service to my family and our country has been noted and appreciated every single day for the past 20 years. Your dedication to duty, while also being a devoted husband and father, represents the very best of what it means to serve others. I wanted to thank you personally for showing me that true strength comes from knowing what matters most in life." The young prince opened the wooden box to reveal a beautiful medal, not an official state decoration, but something far more personal. The medal had been commissioned by Prince George himself, using his own allowance money, and featured an engraving of the Windsor Castle guardhouse surrounded by the words service, honor, family. As Thomas accepted the medal, Prince George continued speaking, his young voice carrying a gravity that reminded everyone present of the leader he would one day become. "You taught me that sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is to choose love over duty, and that true service means being present for the people who need you most. Thank you for that lesson." The ceremony was brief but profound, and as Thomas left the castle that day, he realized that Prince George's understanding of leadership and responsibility far exceeded his years. The boy had learned that acknowledging others' sacrifices and showing genuine appreciation was an essential part of being worthy of the service others provided. The medal joined the wooden soldier on Thomas's bedside table, and together they served as daily reminders of an extraordinary friendship that had developed between two people from completely different worlds. Margaret and Emma were deeply moved by the story of the private ceremony, and it became a source of pride for the entire family. Years passed, and the Mitchell family thrived in ways they had never imagined possible. Margaret's cancer went into complete remission, allowing her to return to her work as a primary school teacher, where she shared stories of courage and service that inspired her young students. Emma received a scholarship to art school and eventually became a sculptor whose work was displayed in galleries across London. Thomas found his new career in private security both fulfilling and flexible, allowing him to protect others while maintaining the family balance that had been so crucial to their happiness. He often spoke to new security guards about the importance of remembering the humanity behind their professional duties. On quiet evenings, Thomas would sometimes tell the story of Prince George's wooden soldier to friends and colleagues, always emphasizing how a simple gesture from a child had changed his entire perspective on life. The story became somewhat legendary among former royal guards, passed down as an example of how the people they protected were real individuals capable of extraordinary compassion and wisdom. Prince George, meanwhile, continued to grow into his role as a future king with the kind of empathy and understanding that would serve him well throughout his life. Mrs. Harrison often noted how the prince's interaction with Thomas Mitchell had shaped his approach to leadership, teaching him that true authority came from recognizing and valuing the people who served others. The wooden soldier remained Thomas's most treasured possession, not because of its monetary value or its royal connection, but because it represented a moment when two people from different worlds had recognized their shared humanity. It served as proof that kindness, respect, and understanding could bridge any gap, whether between a prince and a guard, a father and daughter, or a husband and wife facing life's greatest challenges. In the end, Prince George's silent but meaningful action had accomplished something far greater than either he or Thomas could have imagined at the time. It had reminded a dedicated man that his service mattered, given him the strength to make difficult but necessary choices, and ultimately helped save not just his career, but his family and his faith in the power of human connection. The story of the wooden soldier became Thomas Mitchell's legacy, a tale of how a moment of unexpected kindness from a child had the power to transform lives and remind adults of what truly mattered in a world that often forgot the importance of seeing and valuing each other as human beings deserving of respect and compassion.